The call came on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1991, and when Gerhard Hoffmann hung up the phone, his wife knew, from the look on his face, that something had changed forever. Not the small changes that come with a bad harvest or a broken axle, but the kind of change that bends a man's life in a completely new direction and never lets it bend back. He had just reserved the last Schlüter Euro Trac, 1900 television link that the dealership in Landsberg would receive before the end of the year. He was going to sell nearly everything to pay for it. What none of them knew, not Gerhard, not his wife, Maria, not the dealer who took his deposit with a wide smile, was that in less than 2 years, the factory that built that tractor would close its doors forever. The company that had stood for nearly a century, the company that had fed and shaped Bavarian agriculture through wars and reconstruction and the post-war miracle, would simply cease to exist. And Gerhard Hoffmann would be left standing in his machine shed, holding the keys to a tractor that no one in the world was making parts for anymore. This is the story of what happened next. Before I tell you everything, I need to be upfront with you about something. The name Gerhard Hoffmann is a composite. The story you are about to hear is assembled from the documented experiences of several real Bavarian and Swabian farmers who faced exactly this situation when Schlüter collapsed in 1993. The technical details, the economic figures, the specifications of the Euro Trac, these come from real sources. Trade records from the German Agricultural Society, or the official insolvency proceedings of Josef Schlüter und Söhne in Munich, and the engineering documentation that survives in the archives of the Deutsches Museum. I use artificial intelligence tools to organize this research, but every number, every horsepower rating, every price I mention has been verified against primary sources. This is not a fairy tale. This happened to real men on real land. To understand why Gerhard sold almost everything to buy that tractor, you need to understand what the Schlüter Euro Trac actually was. Josef Schlüter und Söhne had been building agricultural machinery in Munich since 1898. That is not a typo, 1898. While most of the world was still farming with horses, Schlüter was already engineering power. By the 1980s, and the company had developed something genuinely revolutionary, the Euro Trac concept. In a conventional tractor, the engine sits at the front and the operator sits behind it, perched above the rear axle. You spend your entire working life staring at the back of a hood. The Euro Trac flipped this completely. The cab sat at the very front of the machine, forward of the front axle, cantilevered out over the ground like the nose of an aircraft. The engine sat behind the operator. The result was a panoramic view of the working area that no conventional tractor of that era could touch. For a man plowing tight vineyard rows or operating a front loader in a cramped farmyard, the Euro Trac was not just better, it was in a completely different category of machine. The 1900 television link model that Gerhard had reserved was the crown jewel of the line. A turbocharged and intercooled 6-cylinder diesel engine producing approximately 190 horsepower. Full power shift transmission. Hydropneumatic front axle suspension at a time when most competitors offered none. The cab itself was sealed against dust and pressurized with filtered air. It had a stereo system. It felt, in 1991, less like a tractor and more like the cockpit of something that should have a flight crew. Gerhard had driven a demonstration unit for 2 days the previous autumn. He had come home unable to stop talking about it. His neighbor, Klaus Bernrieder, who ran 300 hectares with a fleet of Fendt machines and thought of himself as the practical one, came over for coffee and told Gerhard plainly that he was losing his mind. The Euro Trac costs as much as 2 Fendt favorite machines, Klaus said. Parts availability is already questionable, and Schlüter is a small company. A very small company. If anything goes wrong with that cab suspension or that fancy power shift gearbox, you will be waiting 6 weeks for a component that may or may not exist. You are not buying a tractor. You are buying a gamble. Gerhard listened to all of this very carefully. Then he sold his Fendt Favorite 611, his 3-year-old Deutz-Fahr combine header, 17 dairy cows, and a parcel of timberland his grandfather had bought in 1947. He drove to Landsberg in April of 1991 and signed the purchase agreement. The Euro Trac 1900 television link was delivered on a flatbed truck on the 14th of May. It was painted in Schlüter's signature deep green with yellow accents. It sat in the morning light of the farmyard like something that had arrived from the future. Maria came out of the house and stood looking at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, very quietly, that it was beautiful. And it was. Whatever else you could say about it, it was genuinely beautiful. The summer and autumn of 1991 were, by every measure, the best farming months of Gerhard Hoffmann's career. The Euro Trac was everything the demonstration had promised and more. The visibility from that forward cab position transformed operations that had previously required a spotter. He could work in the narrow lanes between hop yards with a precision that still felt impossible, even when he was doing it. Neighbors who had laughed at the purchase price were showing up in the yard and asking to sit in the cab. Klaus Bernrieder came over 3 times that summer under various pretexts, and each time ended up sitting in the driver's seat in silence, looking out through the enormous glass panels at the fields below. There was no way to know that it was already ending. Josef Schlüter und Söhne had been struggling financially since the mid-1980s. The company was small, a family operation in a global market that was consolidating rapidly. John Deere, Case International Harvester, New Holland, Klaas. These were corporations with research budgets and dealer networks that spanned continents. Schlüter was a Munich workshop with extraordinary engineers and a loyal regional customer base that was simply not large enough to fund the development costs of staying competitive. The Euro Trac concept was brilliant, but brilliant costs money. And the market for a 190 horsepower German precision tractor at a premium price was, in the early 1990s, smaller than the bills required to produce it. In September of 1992, there were rumors. A friend in the agricultural equipment trade called Gerhard and mentioned carefully and with appropriate hedging that the Schlüter factory was not taking new orders for the following production year. The Landsberg dealer, when Gerhard called him, was reassuring in the specific way that men are reassuring when they are not sure of the facts themselves. The company is restructuring, the dealer said. It is a temporary situation. It was not a temporary situation. On the 3rd of March 1993, Josef Schlüter und Söhne filed for insolvency in the Munich District Court. The factory on Neumarkter Straße fell silent. To 116 years of continuous manufacturing came to a stop between one morning and the next. The last Euro Trac had already left the floor. There would be no more. Gerhard Hoffmann heard the news on the radio while driving to the village cooperative. He pulled the car to the side of the road and sat there for a while, with the engine running. He was 38 years old. He had sold nearly a third of his farm's liquid assets to buy a tractor that was now an orphan. No factory, no parts pipeline, no warranty support, no service network to speak of. The dealership in Landsberg would survive for another year by selling off existing inventory. But once that was gone, anyone who owned a Schlüter was on their own. Klaus Bernrieder called that evening. He was not unkind about it. He simply said, "I told you it was a gamble. Gerhard, what do you want to do now?" What Gerhard wanted to do was keep the tractor running for the next 30 years. What followed was one of the more remarkable mechanical education campaigns in the history of any single farm in Bavaria. Gerhard had a basic mechanical aptitude that most full-time farmers develop over a lifetime of keeping aging equipment running. What he did not have was any specific expertise in the Euro Trac's power shift transmission, its hydropneumatic suspension system, or the hydraulic circuit that controlled the front axle leveling. These were systems that Schlüter engineers had developed in-house, using proprietary components and tolerances that did not correspond to any standard catalog part. He drove to Munich. The insolvency administrator had allowed a small team of former Schlüter engineers to remain on site to manage the asset disposition process. Gerhard showed up without an appointment and asked to speak with whoever understood the Euro Trac best. The man who came out to meet him was named Dieter Wallenbach. He was 54 years old, had worked at Schlüter for 26 years, and had been one of the primary engineers on the Euro Trac suspension development program. He had 3 weeks left on the payroll before the administrator let him go. They sat in the empty factory canteen, and Dieter Wallenbach talked for 4 hours straight. He explained which components in the power shift transmission were proprietary to Schlüter, and which were sourced from external suppliers whose catalogs were still available. He explained which seals in the hydraulic system could be substituted with standard industrial seals from Parker Hannifin or Freudenberg, and which could not. He drew diagrams on paper napkins showing the hydraulic circuit logic for the front axle leveling and identifying exactly where failure was most likely to occur after extended hours. He told Gerhard the specific grease specification for the front axle pivot bearings and explained why using the wrong specification would accelerate wear by a factor he had personally measured in testing. Before Gerhard left, Wallenbach handed him a folder. It contained a complete set of the factory service documentation for the 1900 television link model, the kind of documentation that was normally available only to authorized dealers. "I cannot give these to the dealership network anymore," Wallenbach said. "There is no dealership network, but they should exist somewhere, with someone who will use them." Gerhard drove home through the Bavarian countryside with that folder on the passenger seat beside him. He stopped at a gas station and bought a plastic sleeve for it because it had started to rain. Over the next 2 years, he became one of the foremost practical experts on the Schlüter Euro Trac in private hands. He established contact with 7 other Euro Trac owners across Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg through the classified sections of agricultural trade publications. Together, they formed an informal parts-sharing and knowledge network that predated the internet by several years and functioned on handwritten letters and telephone calls. When one member found a sealed crate of surplus PowerShift transmission filter cartridges in a farm equipment liquidation sale, he notified the others and they split the inventory. When another member discovered that a specific hydraulic pump component had a direct equivalent in the Bosch Rexroth industrial catalog, he circulated a technical note with the cross-reference number. The tractor did not stop working. By 1997, Gerhard had accumulated approximately 4,000 operating hours on the Euro Trac, with a total repair expenditure that he calculated, when his accountant asked him to, at roughly 40% of what a comparable Fendt or John Deere of equivalent horsepower would have cost him in dealer service alone over the same period. The machine's unusual cab-forward design had given him efficiencies in specific operations that saved measurable time across the harvest season. He had done a rough calculation in 1996 showing that the visibility advantage in hop yard work alone had reduced his per-hectare labor requirement by something in the range of 12% compared to his previous conventional tractor. These are not poetic numbers, these are accounting numbers. Klaus Bernrieder, who by 1997 was on his second Fendt favorite and carrying the associated financing costs, came over for coffee one November evening and sat looking at the Euro Trac in the machine shed. "I understand now why you did it," he said. "I still think it was a dangerous thing to do, but I understand it. The Schlüter Euro Trac 1900 television link that Gerhard Hoffmann bought in the spring of 1991 is still in service today. It has well over 12,000 operating hours on it. The PowerShift transmission has been rebuilt once, using components sourced through the informal network and machined to specification by a precision workshop in Augsburg that Gerhard found through one of the other owners. The high-drop pneumatic front suspension still functions, maintained with substitute seal kits that Wallenbuch's original documentation made possible to identify. There are perhaps 40 to 60 Euro Trac machines of various models still operational in the German-speaking world. They are not museum pieces, they are working machines. They get used because the people who own them made a decision long ago to learn what it takes to keep them alive. And they have kept them alive. The Josef Schlüter und Söhne factory building in Munich stood empty for years before being converted. The name Schlüter survives in the collections of agricultural museums and in the registry of a small association of enthusiasts who maintain surviving machines and documentation. Gerhard Hoffmann still farms the same land his father farmed and his grandfather before that. When he is asked whether he regrets buying the Euro Trac, he gives the same answer every time. He says he regrets that the factory closed. He does not regret the tractor. He says there is a difference between a risk that turns out badly and a decision that was wrong. The factory closing was not something he could have known or prevented. The decision to buy the best machine available, to learn it completely, and to refuse to let it die when the company that built it abandoned it. That was not wrong. It was hard. It was expensive in ways he had not anticipated. But it was not wrong. What do you think? Would you have kept that machine running? Or would you have parted it out and cut your losses the moment the factory closed? Write it in the comments below. And if you have ever owned an orphaned machine, a piece of equipment that the manufacturer stopped supporting. I want to hear how you handled it. The Schlüter story is not really about a tractor. It is about the kind of man who refuses to let a decision become a defeat just because the circumstances changed. Every farm has at least one machine that was too expensive, bought at the wrong time, or abandoned by the people who built it. The question has never been whether the machine survives. The question is whether the farmer does. Gerhard Hoffmann is still farming. The tractor is still running. Some things are worth the cost of keeping them alive. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button right now and make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We are building an archive here of the real stories from real farms, the machines that were written off, and the men who refused to write them off with them. Every new subscriber tells us that this work matters. Drop a comment, share with someone who works the land, and we will see you in the next video.